Welcome everyone to the fourth session of the Climate Finance Academy. My name is Kiara and I'm the director of this year's Academy. We have a really exciting lineup for today's session. We hope that you guys enjoy it. So I will now pass the microphone on to Sophia, who is our speaker and content partner lead for the Academy. Sophia, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon, everyone, and a warm welcome to session 4. The session 4 is Access and Equity in Climate Finance. To launch our discussion in the critical role of policy and regulation, it is my great pleasure to introduce our opening speaker, Professor Jan Rosenau. Professor Rosenau is leading global authority on sustainable energy policy, serving as a professor of energy and climate policy at the University of Oxford, and leading the energy program at the Environmental Change Institute. He is also senior advisor at the Regulatory Assistance Project, providing strategic guidance to international organizations like the United Nations and the International Energy Agency. His work, which is focused on energy efficiency and electrification, directly influences global climate policies and has been recognized as making him the most read thought leader on the energy transition in 2024. We are truly honored to have him set the stage for our session. Mr. Rosenau, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I hope you can hear me all right. I have a few slides to share. I don't know whether I share them myself or whether they will be shared by the technical team. You should now see my screen. Excellent. Okay, so I'm going to talk about the energy transition at large and then focus a bit on the role of finance. I want to talk about the opportunities and some of the risks related to finance in particular. So the outline for my talk looks like this. It's pretty simple. I start high level, looking at the transition and my perspective on it, then talk about finance and then zoom in on opportunities and risks. And I will talk about the gas grid as one particular example here and then wrap up. How much time do I have for the talk? Is it about 20 minutes? Is that right? Yes, I see you nodding. Excellent. So I'm just going to make sure I stick to time and I start now. What will the transition look like? Of course, there's no clear answer to that question. I'm just going to give you a brief outline what I think the transition might look like. And I start maybe perhaps with a challenge. We often see on social media graphics like this. This is global primary energy consumption, and you can see it's going up, and especially the fossil fuel component is going up. And because of that, people like this person here on the right-hand side say that we can't possibly transition away from fossil fuels. It's too difficult. There's simply too many of them. And the term that's being used is there is no energy transition, but it's an energy addition. So we're just adding renewables on top, but keep growing fossil fuels. I will tell you in a minute why I think that is misguided, but it's definitely an argument that is being made very frequently. And now I'm going to explain why I think it is a misguided argument. So this is a typical Sankey diagram. I've used the UK as an example. You could also use the world or any country you want to pick. And typically these diagrams show you on the left-hand side all the energy inputs in the system, and on the right-hand side all the energy use within the system. What you don't see is how inefficient our energy system is by looking at that. It looks like, we're just putting energy in and distributing it and then using it. But actually, I want you to focus on the top right corner in a second. And you see here, this is one of the few diagrams that actually shows us the so-called rejected energy or the wasted energy. And at the top, bottom right, you see the energy services. That's the stuff we actually want: mobility, warmth, industrial plants running, etc. So the key message really is, and this applies at global level too, most of the energy inputs we currently have are being wasted. And that is because of the inefficiency of converting energy to useful energy services. So the argument that we have to replace all of the fossil fuels on the left-hand side, and that's going to be all too difficult, doesn't really hold, because if we have better alternatives, which we do, that are more efficient, we only have to replace the fraction of them that is actually ending up as useful energy services. And we know that one of these kind of levers that we have is electrification. So currently electricity makes up about a quarter, perhaps 20% of our global final energy use. Most of the energy we actually use is for heat, and few people know that. You know, the discussion that you see in the media tends to focus on the tip of the iceberg, on electricity, you know, renewables versus coal plants or nuclear. But actually, about half of all our energy use is for heat, and that's about 25% in buildings and the other 25% in industry. And then the remainder is for transportation. And most of that is currently based on fossil fuels. So in the future, this will fundamentally change, most analysts believe. So the IEA, the International Energy Agency, but also organizations like the Energy Transitions Commission or national analysis by the European Commission at regional level or the UK government shows that actually fast forward to 2050, electricity will become a much more important part of our final energy use. And we will have an inversion, essentially, of the energy system where electricity that's currently providing, in final energy terms, the smallest share will provide the biggest share. And why is that? Well, the main reason for that is that electricity is significantly more efficient in end use, but also the way it's been generated will change fundamentally from burning fossil fuels to using wind and solar primarily, but also other forms of low carbon generation. And now I want to talk a bit about the role of finance in actually achieving that. So how do we get from a heavily fossil fuel based system that is relying on combustion of fuels to one that is highly electrified and highly renewable? And the first graphic I'm going to show you just illustrates the scale of the challenge. This is from the Energy Transition Commission. It's now a couple of years old, as the numbers will have changed somewhat, but it just shows where the Energy Transition Commission believe most of the investment will need to be made. And you find is that most of it goes into power generation, also electricity networks and storage. So that's well aligned with what I've just told you on the slide before, that electricity is going to provide the lion's share of our energy needs in the future because of the higher efficiency. So that's where most of the investment will be. And you also see that a lot of the investment is front-loaded. There will be a point where that peters off. That's the bottom right here, and we have less investment needs every year. But for now, it's rising quite steeply from where we are today. More than double by 2040 has to be invested in the energy system, most of that into the power sector, according to the Energy Transitions Commission. There's some good news. We're actually already making pretty good progress with the financial system globally and where money is being invested. And let me show you a graph from the IEA that is frequently updated. You see here the amount of fossil fuel investment in light blue for each of the years. And you can tell from the graph that it's somewhat gone down since 2015, not massively, but it has declined a bit. What's more interesting, though, is the investment in clean energy. And that used to be less than what we invest in fossil fuels. If you focus on the year 2015 on the left-hand side, but it's gone up since 2016. It's been bigger than fossil fuel investment. And most interestingly, in more recent years, we actually get to a point now where it's almost double. And that makes a huge difference, of course, to what technologies get built and how we're progressing in terms of expanding that investment that we need to see in clean energy technology. There's a nice visualization of this actually by visual capitalists. They tend to be quite good in visualizing some of these numbers, where you can see it more dramatically, I think, in terms of global energy investment and how that's shifting. On the left-hand side, this is all energy, not just electricity. And you just see how renewables, starting from a fairly small base in 2015, really became a very dominant area of investment. And then also for global electricity, solar just stands out. And that is really remarkable, I think, given how quickly this has happened. And now this is what the IEA is saying. The investment in solar PV actually surpasses all the investment in other generation technologies combined. So that's coal, gas, wind, hydro, bio, and it's only electricity. But that's a major development that would have been unthinkable 20 years ago when I started to work on energy. Solar was absolutely tiny. So there's been a major shift already in how finance is driving the transition towards a cleaner energy system. I hope that gives you a bit of a flavor of sort of where things are headed in terms of the global financial sector. Definitely some very encouraging changes there. I now want to talk about the opportunities that I see for future investments. And won't cover all of the areas. I will just pick a few. But I wanted to start because I think this is also about access and equity in particular. This session. Perhaps start with recent experience from Pakistan, which is a really interesting case study. And there are others that are similar. So Pakistan was not known necessarily as a clean energy leader globally, but in 2024, so last year, we've seen record installs of solar panels, and Pakistan was the country that imported the largest number of Chinese-made solar panels, and China is the biggest producer of them. Real record growth in Pakistan, and you can see it on Google Earth. If you sort of look at some of the satellite images in 2022, perhaps in 2024, you see a real difference. Why is this happening in Pakistan? Not so much because of policy, but really because individuals are voting with their feet and installing this technology. And we're seeing a lot more opportunities just like this, where now suddenly lots of African countries have also started to install solar at a micro scale, sometimes off-grid together with batteries. And there is certainly opportunities for finance models to enable this to happen and to spread this technology more quickly. And that's a really interesting, I think, trend. In the past, a lot of the investment happened in the global north, and that's where a lot of the renewables have been installed, and in China. But we're now seeing an expansion into other countries that previously did not see a lot of investment. Industry. I mentioned heat before, that about 50% of our energy use is for heat currently, and that's mainly fossil fuels. I was in Hungary last week to witness the inauguration of one of the world's largest electrothermal batteries. So this is basically heat storage, molten salt converting electricity that's being used to charge this heat battery. Usually it's solar electricity when it's cheap in Hungary to do that, and it's delivering steam to a local food manufacturing site. And again, this is emerging technology. It's not widespread yet. This is only starting to happen now. But there's huge potential to use pretty cheap materials like sand, bricks, salt, and other products to build batteries that don't rely on lithium-ion batteries, but actually use materials that are fairly abundant and use them to store cheap renewable energy and convert it to heat needed for industrial sites. Here's a large industrial heat pump. I think we need lots of them in the future. Industry currently has about maybe 4% electricity as a share of the process heat that it uses, and that's most of the energy use in industry and responsible for most of the carbon emissions. So large heat pumps like this one, which is in Denmark and Esbjerg, will require a huge amount of investment going forward, and we're just seeing that market to evolve. There's a big conference next month in Prague where we'll speak, and a lot of the companies will be there that provide the solutions, but we still need to see more investment in the sector now following from a big investment in the power sector. And maybe just one last one on industry. This is the first electric steam cracker worldwide that's been built in Ludwigshafen by BASF. It's the world's biggest chemical company. And this is a good example of maybe perhaps more difficult to electrify segments of the industry with higher temperatures. This is about 850 degrees centigrade. And doing that, of course, requires massive investment. And we're just at the very beginning of this process. This is not a competitive, commercially operating project. It's a pilot project currently supported by a significant subsidy from the German government. But industry, I believe, is definitely one of the areas where we have to see a lot more investment beyond what is currently already being done. And then grids. I mean, I don't know, which countries participants are all coming from, but in a lot of places, we now find that the grid is becoming the bottleneck to the energy transition. And here's an example from the Netherlands. I attended a conference where I was speaking just before the summer on grid bottlenecks in the Netherlands. And this map shows you just how long it takes to connect to the grid, either whether you want to feed in your electricity through maybe a new solar park, or you want to connect new factories or fast chargers to the grid. Most of the areas in the Netherlands are colored here in red, which means there is just no capacity to connect to the medium and high voltage grid, and you might have to wait years. There's other countries where we see similar issues emerging, and the grid build out is a massive challenge and will require a vast amount of investment. And indeed, if you remember one of my earlier slides, there was a significant chunk just for grid build out allocated by the Energy Transition Commission to the global investment overall in the energy sector that we will need to see. So grids clearly will play a very important role, and we see a massive need for more investment there. And then finally, thermal storage. This is perhaps one that is not getting a lot of headlines, but people talk a lot about hydrogen and new electric batteries. And in fact, there was just a piece in the Financial Times yesterday about electric batteries, and that's fascinating. But I think other areas that have not received so much attention are more around thermal storage again, and this is connected to district heat. And this is a depiction of what the world's largest thermal storage device will look like. It's in an underground cavern in Finland, and it can store about 90 gigawatt hours of thermal energy, which of course is huge. Why is that interesting? Well, we're going to see a lot more seasonal variability with energy use and also production. So having thermal energy storage is really important, and is an area I think that's overlooked because there's not really a market for long-term storage yet. But we're clearly going to need these technologies. So that's a nascent, perhaps segment of technology, which I personally believe has huge potential. And I want to talk just briefly about some of the risks as well for investors, for finance, because we often hear about the opportunities, but there are also clearly some significant risks. And I just wanted to use one particular example because I don't have time to cover all of them. And I want to use the gas grid as an example. So globally, the gas grid is absolutely vast. But if we just zoom in on Europe, which is the region I've worked on the most, the size of the transmission grid alone is about 3 times the circumference of the Earth. So that's about 150, maybe 140 million kilometers of gas transmission pipelines around Europe that we've built. The gas distribution grid, that's even more. That's 45 times the circumference of the Earth. And that gas grid infrastructure, that has lifetimes of many, many years, many decades. And investors have put a lot of money into this infrastructure. However, if we look at the implications of the transition, we will see a decline in gas demand, and that means an underutilization of that infrastructure. And what does this mean for the viability of the infrastructure going forward? So I think those are questions that are really difficult, and they have huge equity implications, because if you think about the people who are actually using the gas grid, well, that's pretty much all of us, unless we have transitioned away from gas successfully and installed a heat pump in our house. We probably dependent on the gas grid in some form or another. Also small businesses or large businesses. And who's going to pay for the gas grid if more and more people leave it? So you have this sort of death spiral of this infrastructure. but there's significant equity implications as to who is going to pay for the infrastructure as it gets no longer used to the same degree that it is used today. And I don't think we have all the answers yet. I thought about this for quite a bit, and I have some answers, but I don't have time to go into that now. But this is definitely an area, I think, where there's huge risks around stranded assets. And we have seen, the first places that have announced the shutdown of the gas distribution grid already by 2035. This is the city of Mannheim, and they made global headlines when they announced last year, I think it was, that they're going to shut down the entire gas grid in their city by 2035. And Mannheim is not a small city. It's a city of significant size in Germany. And there are other examples. You may look at Basel in Switzerland, where there are similar plans to phase out the gas infrastructure. And there's also more examples from other cities around Europe and beyond. So this is a real issue. And I don't think we have resolved this yet at all. And there's still a lot of investment tied up in these gas infrastructures, often pension funds and institutional investors. So again, there are risks for citizens and there are risks for businesses that have their investments tied up in that infrastructure, perhaps not being aware of that even, because how many people actually know what exactly their pension fund is invested in? I assume most people have no idea to what extent they might be exposed to these stranded costs in the future. I want to wrap up and leave enough time also for the other speakers for any questions and comments. And I want to wrap up perhaps on a positive note after having talked about the challenge of sort of stranded assets and exposure there to risks. And perhaps I go back to solar because I think it's just such a good example of how far we've come in this. And just yesterday, somebody told me they've actually seen what you see here in the picture at a trade fair where companies are offering solar fences now, and which seems ridiculous, right? If somebody told me that in 2004 when I first looked at the cost of solar, I would have laughed about that. Why would you ever build a solar fence? That seems a crazy idea, way too expensive. But the reality is that solar fences are now are cheaper now in some cases than using wood for the panels. I'm not saying you should always build a solar fence, but it's definitely I think a symbol of how much the costs have come down. And going back to this whole question of access and equity, to me that suggests it's never been easier in principle to make this technology available to people who don't have lots of capital, who don't have perhaps financial support from government, who can't take out loans, just because the costs are now so beneficial that often solar is the cheapest way of generating electricity. So I think we're going to see a lot more of this in the future, and there's lots of hope. I think even though we still have a lot of challenges to overcome, but I look forward to any comments, any questions, and also the other speakers later in the session. Thank you very much for listening. And if you want, you can also follow me on LinkedIn. I'm pretty active on social media, and I share more content there on a very frequent basis. And thanks for listening. And apologies for the flickering screen. I'm not quite sure why it does that.
Thank you so much, Professor Rosenau, for that really insightful presentation on the intersection of policy and equitable energy transition. I was taking notes, so I hope that participants were also taking notes. I want to ask our participants to show the hand raised or to send our questions in the Q&A or in chat, so we can ask Professor. Marco, please, the floor is yours.
Hi, thank you, Sophia, and thank you for the great presentation, Professor. My question is about the growth of solar, the explosion of solar energy. And I think my question is there a possibility of what I would call like peak solar? Because where there's a saturation in the market or like an overinvestment in solar energy if this pace of adoption continues. Yeah, thank you.
Great question. I might just answer that by saying, yeah, I think right now we see overcapacity. So I think China has built so much capacity that there's way more capacity than needed to satisfy demand. But I also think that when we just look at the numbers of installed capacity year by year, the pace is just unbelievable. Like when you look at the actual numbers, the market is expanding so fast that what is now overcapacity will quickly just be enough to satisfy demand. So I'm not sure we've reached peak solar yet. And I think actually we might be surprised by how because and I say that because I think especially in countries that are solar rich and have huge energy needs, like many of the African countries, right? They're just, I think, now getting to a space where there's an economic case and where the cost of capital that was a major barrier perhaps is no longer a major barrier simply because the cost of solar have come down so much. And it's less risky to invest in companies that engage in the solar sector there. So I think we might be surprised, but it'd be interesting to see what happens in 5 years' time. Whether or not we've reached the peak. I would guess not, because we've been surprised again and again by just the pace of solar.
Sorry. Thank you, Professor. We have some questions in the chat. Safio asked, what specific policies can the government introduce to reduce the cost of installing solar systems for households and businesses?
That's a question about finance, right? And yes, absolutely. And so maybe I give you one example of what I think is a really neat way of providing that sort of support. But before I do that, what I don't think we need is in pretty wealthy countries, we no longer, especially for wealthier households, we won't need any subsidy anymore for solar. So that's been we've actually seen those schemes being withdrawn by governments. In the UK, where I live, there's no longer any subsidy unless you fall into a certain income category. But for most households, there's no subsidy on offer anymore for solar installs. But let me give you the example now that I think might be really interesting. So we had someone here from Nigeria in Oxford before the summer break, and his company was using World Bank finance to offer people in off-grid locations a package of solar panel, battery, and an LCD screen so they could watch television. And the package of these three technologies was seen as quite attractive because you're not only getting electricity for charging your mobile phone for lighting and potentially other users, but you're also getting a flat screen TV, and that was the way in to persuading people to adopt this technology. And I think now it's spreading so fast because people just learn about the technology working and how it can be useful to them. So I think that's a really interesting way of using government subsidy to spread. I think it should be targeted for those people who need the support the most, rather than everybody should get solar subsidies, because the technology doesn't require that anymore at that scale.
Thank you for your answer. We will ask you just one more question because we need to continue with the speakers. Ricardo Orozco asked, how is equitable access to final decarbonization technologies understood in the same context as equitable access to and control of the crucial raw materials needed to produce them?
Difficult one, and we clearly don't have equitable access and control through critical raw materials right now. And I think there's a whole question about the sustainability of the current mining practices. Where do these materials come from? I didn't really get into that. And I think it is important. I think even just having data on what are the critical raw materials that are needed in different sectors is quite poor. And what does the transition mean for which countries we might be dependent on? I think there's still a lot of work that needs to be done, a lot of research that needs to be done around this question. And clearly there are certain countries that are already in control of large parts of the supply chain. So it's definitely some risks there that I think we better get on top of rather than wait until we end up in a difficult situation where it's highly concentrated in a very small number of countries.
Thank you, Professor. Our next speaker will further deepen our exploration of access and equity in climate finance. We are dedicated to ensuring equal representation from all continents, so the global north and the global south, and it's therefore a great honor to introduce Mr. Jordan. Professor Jordan is an assistant professor in the Department of Economics and the Institute for Sustainable Development at Pontificia Universidad Católica de Chile. I'm sorry if I don't know to say it right, because I'm not native speaker. Also, he is educated at Harvard University with a PhD in political economy and government, and his research is highly relevant to our work. Philippe leverages machine learning and novel data to study the impact of policies and institutions on economic prosperity and environmental sustainability. So, Mr. Philippe, please, the floor is yours. I think our participants can't wait to hear from you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I'll try to share my screen. Let me see. Is this working?
Yes.
Yes. Can you hear me? Can you see the slides? Perfect.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation. So I'll take you to are related by different contexts in terms of the relation between climate finance and equity. And my question comes to the very, I guess, heart of what are the big potential solutions to the global south, that is climate-based solutions, that is mitigation in terms of keeping carbon on the ground and storing more carbon on the ground, and how this intersects with the fight of indigenous peoples across the world to secure their property rights and their rights to manage and use their ancestral lands. And the question is whether there's an opportunity here, a win-win solution, and also what are the risks of maybe focusing too much on this potential win-win. So let's start with a basic fact. Indigenous peoples are estimated, there's different ranges, but about a quarter of the Earth's surface is managed, not owned, but managed or customer used by indigenous people. And this is not any land. This is land that overlaps with 40% of protected areas. This is land that has tons and tons and tons of carbon that ideally we would like to keep it on the ground. So given this fact, any global, regional, or local plan to use land-based solutions as a climate mitigation strategy should seriously consider how the instruments they will use to incentivize keeping the carbon in the ground will interact with indigenous peoples from a human rights perspective. So the big question is whether land-based solutions offer a win-win solution over climate mitigation and human rights. Do advancing the development and implementation of this instrument help promote both a better climate for the future and progress in the human rights agenda in terms of recognizing and repairing harm, recognizing indigenous people rights and repairing past harms. So a first fact of the research in the area, there's a lot of research on a very first condition that you need before even thinking about offsets and payment for ecosystem services and all of those instruments. First, you need to provide secure property rights for indigenous people, because if you're gonna make any financial instrument, you need to have a party that actually holds control over the asset you want to influence with your instrument. And research, I'd say it's pretty clear. This is one of those cases where research is very clear that just securing property rights by itself to indigenous peoples tend to be a win-win solution in terms of both you're progressing the human rights agenda with these people and you're keeping carbon in the ground. So there's this extensive literature showing this robust association between indigenous peoples' right to manage land and reduce deforestation or increase forest regeneration. And importantly, this is not only a robust association, because you may think, well, maybe indigenous people are just located, they live in more remote areas where there's very little risk for deforestation. So it's not that really is the fact that indigenous people are the steward of the land, it's just that they inhabit territories that are very different and that wouldn't be deforested anyway because they are far away from roads, far away from markets. Well, we know that that's not really the case. We know that there's a causal link that securing property rights for indigenous people actually causally reduces deforestation. I want to walk you through one particular study, and there's also a follow-up study, but uses a very similar strategy just to show you how researchers can disentangle the causal direction. Is it that indigenous stewardship actually causes deforestation, or that indigenous people just live in these places that have less deforestation? So what are Baraguanath and Bayi doing this paper? They're focusing on Brazil. And Brazil, in the Brazilian legal Amazon, there has been this process since the 1988 Constitution of recognition of indigenous people's collective property rights. So, Brazil is huge. The Amazon is huge in Brazil. So you have these indigenous reservations that can easily be the size of European countries. So they're like very, very massive, large places with a lot of carbon on them. And what has been happening is that Brazil has very slowly but steadily recognizing these property rights through a process first that comes with a demarcation of what are the ancestral lands of these people, and it culminates with what is called the homologation of these territories. That is, these territories receive a property title that officially recognize these people as the stewards of this land. And that importantly gives also these people access to federal resources instead of enforcement of the law, of the environmental laws, to actually protect their land, not by themselves, but with the help of the federal government. And this process of homologation has been patchy. It didn't happen all at once, but it's actually a continuing process. There are still a lot of territories that have not been homologated and are still in the process of moving towards homologation. So what they're doing, the research strategy, is that they're going to be focusing on, for instance, this indigenous territory, and then they focus right on the boundary of the territory. And they will be comparing using satellite imagery, keeping track of what is going on with deforestation right inside the boundary and right outside the boundary. Okay? And this is what they find. So how do we read this? Here we have three groups. First, we have in panel A, the group of indigenous reservations that have not been homologated. That means that we know what are the territories that are in the process of homologation, but they still haven't received an official title recognizing their rights to steward their land. And here we're looking at average deforestation by beings with distance from the boundary. From the outside, that would be the negative numbers, and then from the inside. And basically, when you're looking at this in the non-homologated territories, you see a continuum. There's no much action right at the boundary. Then what happens with the territories that actually have been homologated during the period, but before they were homologated? Then you can start to see some discontinuity here that start to hint that once you're approaching the process of homologation, that starts to empower indigenous people to be stewards of the land and combat deforestation. And that becomes much clearer once we move to the analysis in the reservations that have been homologated and after they were homologated. And this is what we can really link to the causal impact of homologation, of recognizing these people's property rights, because we're comparing pixels that are just 2 kilometers away. One happens to be inside indigenous territory, the other one happens to be outside indigenous territory, and we see this large discontinuous jump right at the boundary of about 0.8 percentage points in deforestation, where deforestation was reduced within the indigenous territory. This is one paper, but there are several papers that have been showing with different empirical strategies, basically the same story, that especially in the context of Brazil, Peru, Ecuador, generally in all of Latin America, where in tropical forest, empowering indigenous people reduces deforestation. And this actually is a quote from, I would say, one of the first papers that used this regression discontinuity strategy. That's the name of the empirical strategy in the context of Brazil. And they conclude that indigenous land are currently the most important barrier to Amazon deforestation. Also, demystifying this idea that indigenous territories are always in very remote areas, because what has happened is that at some point, some indigenous territories, when indigenous people were pushed off their land, were in remote territories, but the agricultural frontier keeps moving. So a lot of those territories where indigenous people were pushed to now are at the agricultural frontier. So they're playing a key role in terms of carbon sequestration and climate change mitigation. Well, what does all of this mean for climate finance? First, as I said at the beginning of the talk, recognizing property rights for indigenous people, it's a precondition for thinking about any program that will incentivize carbon storage over indigenous territory. And the good news is that precondition by itself has big returns in terms of climate mitigation. Then one may ask, right, maybe it's just enough to secure property rights, and that is already providing a large impact in terms of carbon mitigation. We don't know for sure what would be the additional benefit of securing, on top of securing property rights, making available, maybe through subsidies, some financial instruments to incentivize carbon sequestration in these territories. And I would say, I would adventure at this point that is not quite, and this is based on pieces of evidence that I will show, because securing property rights is necessary, but it's not sufficient to halt environmental degradation in these territories. And I want to make a couple of points on that, and with that, I think I'll be concluding. And this is a quote from the same paper from Barawat and Bayi. And one key point that they raise in their research is that it is not necessarily just demarcating property rights, right? When we saw before that the territories that were homologated, that is the formal recognition from the federal government, but before homologation, when they were already demarcated, we don't see a big effect in terms of deforestation. The effect really comes with this official recognition. And what is this official recognition given? It's given not just a property right, but it's also given as Indigenous people are officially recognized by the federal government as the legitimate owners of that piece of land, that means that they can grab the phone and call from help from the enforcement agencies when they are facing a threat from invasors that are deforesting their lands. They are not by their own. They have the support of the state instead of enforcing environmental laws and enforcing their right to be stewards of their land. So this means that it's not enough to secure property rights. Indigenous people being in most cases marginalized communities that live in poverty, they also need additional support, additional resources to effectively be stewards of their land. And then there's a second question, or a second angle that is quite interesting, that most of the research that we know in terms of securing property rights and deforestation comes from the context where you are securing Indigenous people property rights over land that they have continuously managed for centuries. But we know that Indigenous people actually used to manage the whole American continent, and that they have been displaced through centuries to small patches that they have continuously managed for the last 50, 40 years. Those patches are the focus of most research. But there has been a push across the continent. We can mention, for instance, the land buyback program in the US, also efforts in Canada, and also in Chile, where I will focus in the rest of this presentation, to amend harms done in the past to Indigenous people by buying back land and giving back land to Indigenous people that has been out of their control for centuries or decades. So ancestral lands that were engulfed by the agricultural frontier, and giving some of that land back to Indigenous people. This has pretty large potential in terms of climate, because these are lands that are today mostly agricultural lands. So that means that these are lands that, if managed from a more environmental perspective, they could become reservoirs, new reservoirs of carbon. They could take carbon out of the air and store them in the land in terms of forest, if forest regenerates in this land. But we actually don't know whether this will happen, whether this will be the choice of the Indigenous people, and whether just securing property rights or providing a control for Indigenous families over these territories will do that by themselves. So here I want to review a second study, which I've been involved in this study, that studies the impact of restitution of land in the case of Chile for a very large land restitution program that has been going on from 3 decades on Chile. And here we want to study basically what happens to land cover. What do Indigenous people do with this land that they received? And what happens to carbon storage? And actually what we find in terms of the impacts of this policy, how we read this graph, we have 4 plots here. And these is showing how the parcel that is restituted to Indigenous people is distributed across cropland, grassland, natural forest, and plantation forest. And this is showing year 0, that is the year of restitution. And then we see what is the effect with respect to that year in terms of changes in land cover. And what we see actually is a transition towards these Indigenous people. This is for Mapuche people in Chile, more traditional land cover classes in a context, of course, of already more than a century of living incorporated into the Chilean nation, into a market economy. And we see first that there's a big increase in grassland that is linked to livestock raising. That is one of the most important traditional economic activities. And we're actually in plantation forest. The plantation forest have grown a lot from the 70s and 80s, 1970s and 1980s, subsidized by the state, and have sparked a lot of conflict with Indigenous communities. So we see this transition towards a traditional production. And in terms of carbon sequestration, actually, as plantation forests still store carbon, but there's a small effect on natural forests that store more carbon. Actually, we see that there's no much effect on carbon sequestration. So what do we take for this? I think this is a very important point because we see that just securing property rights will not necessarily promote carbon storage. And this, I want to bring this quote from the indigenous law in Chile. That is the law that is still governing how this policy runs. And that in its first article, always the first article is mentioning the most important things in a law, says that part of the duty of the state is to promote policies that will safeguard the ecological balance of these lands. And what we see here is that just by providing property rights is not enough. That providing just property rights is not enough for these people to, for instance, take care of their natural forests in this case. And then, in terms of conclusions, I first mentioned that the efforts to formalize indigenous people claims that have been pushed over the last 40 years it does constitute a win-win. So it does have big climate co-benefits, yet it is probably not enough. So we need additional support to secure that these indigenous people can effectively be stewards of their land. And I think this is probably one of the most important points is that while win-win solutions are possible and are desirable, we should never condition policy that is grounded on human rights, that is policy that is grounded on the fact that these people have been mistreated by modern state throughout centuries and that they require reparation today out of fairness. We should never condition those policies on environmental outcomes. In other terms, sometimes some NGOs might have this idea that indigenous people are intrinsically greener, and we should never base policy on that precondition because that imposes an unfair burden on indigenous people in terms of sharing a disproportionate burden of climate mitigation. And in that sense, I think that carbon instruments such as payment for ecosystem services or including deforestation in offset programs provide a nice balance because these are instruments that provide incentives and financial support for these people to be effective environmental stewards of their land, but they do not impose an expectation, for instance, which I think would be a mistake, that indigenous people need to meet certain environmental goals in order to secure their property rights. So it's important to exploit the virtuous interaction between climate mitigation and the human rights agenda, but we should never condition the human rights agenda on the climate agenda. And I think with that, I'm right on time. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Professor Jordan, for that fascinating presentation, especially your insights on how advanced data science intersects with development in Global South. I think now you will receive many questions from our participants. So I will ask them to raise their hands or write in question in chat. Okay, we have one raised hand. Marco, please, the floor is yours.
Hi, thank you first of all for such an insightful presentation. My question is around the legality of indigenous owners' rights, especially in context where there's like constitutional law and then there are traditional knowledge systems, law systems in place that govern land ownership, especially in indigenous areas. So, for example, in my context, there's no such thing, or like there's no concept of like a title deed, or like or someone getting like legal documentation in indigenous areas that they own that land, because that kind of concept isn't really applicable for traditional systems. It's like so how is it possible to reconcile situations where there are two different forms or ideas of land ownership and systems of land ownership, in order to protect, the ownership rights of indigenous people in legal systems?
Thank you. That's a great question. I think there's a way in which traditional ways of managing and holding land have been interpreted by, let's say, Western institutions. And that is, in a lot of contexts, the idea of property rights that are held not by individuals, by a community. So in that sense, for instance, in the case of the Brazilian process of homologation that I was referring to, the property right is not given to an individual, but to the whole community. And then internally, that community can manage specifically how the land is distributed, which lands will be used collectively, which in most cases is most of the land, internally through their traditional customs. It's important to keep in mind that that's one instrument, but it's not the only instrument. And in a lot of contexts, depending on the process of how these indigenous people have related to market, and in some sense, how much have they integrated into market institutions and choose a development path that embraces some of the Western market institutions. In some cases, that can be combined with the consent of the indigenous people, of course, with more individual landholding property rights over some of the areas that allow them to also access some of the same instrument that non-indigenous people would have in their own countries, some as agricultural extensionists and agricultural subsidies, agricultural insurance, and so on.
Thank you for your answers. Does anyone else have some question for professors? You can put it in the chat or raise your hand. Okay, dear Peter, you can ask.
Hi, good afternoon from my end. We have a very complicated situation in my country. Our government contracted a company to come and do dredging of our water system, and the communities that are living around it are not agreeing to that. And so this is already bringing a very huge conflict. And what's happening now is that the government, because we know the government is very strong, they're trying to enforce it. They're really trying to enforce it on the local communities. And the tensions are growing every day. Environmental activists are looking at what policy they can come up with and present it to the government. So I assume this is the right platform. I wanted to know, considering this case, what could be one of the policies that can be considered? Thank you.
Thank you for your question. I think the situation you describe is exactly why insecurity in property rights leads to more deforestation, and generally why securing property rights can help. Why? Because when you have contested property rights, the incentive for any landowner is to think on the present, because they do not have any security that they will remain there in the future. So that leads to basically the predatory behavior in terms of the land and leads to environmental degradation. I wouldn't. I'm not in a position to actually recommend any policy because I don't know the specific case. I'm happy to talk later if you follow up with me. But my sense from my reading of the literature is that a very precondition, as I said before, is securing property rights, is defining clearly whether the community has the right to be stewards of their land.
Thank you so much, Mr. Jordan. Now, because we see that Mr. Kamen need to travel, I want to tell everyone to give applause for Mr. Jordan for such a nice presentation. I hope that you all like it. It was really full of new information and amazing. Thank you so much. We now transition to our third distinguished speaker of session 4, and it's my immense privilege to introduce Professor Daniel Kamen. Professor Kamen is a world-renowned expert who is now the Bloomberg Distinguished Professor of Energy and Climate Justice at Johns Hopkins University, with affiliation across the CAAS and the Department of Civil and Systems Engineering. He's also the founding director of the Renewable Energy and Equity Worldwide Laboratory. He is educated in physics at Cornell and Harvard University, and his deep technical and policy expertise is widely recognized. Previously, he served as the World Bank Group's first chief technical specialist for renewable energy and energy efficiency, and has contributed to numerous reports of Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which shared the 2007 Nobel Peace Prize. Professor Kamen is uniquely positioned to address the financial and technical pathways for achieving just and sustainable energy access, particularly through the crucial lens of climate justice. Professor Kamen, the virtual floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much, and thanks to the audience. I appreciated hearing the prior comments as well about land use and indigenous people. So, okay, I'm just going to share the screen. There we go, and just let me know if for any reason you cannot see them.
Okay, we can see it.
Very good. Let me just go into full. There we go. Okay, so it is a real pleasure to join you. And while the topic is climate finance, I, as you heard in the introduction, am a physicist. And so in hopefully helpful ways, I do my best to know nothing about finance. Mainly because, as you'll see in the next slides, I fear and think that we are way behind on doing what we already could do quite easily. And I don't want to say bad things about policy because I'm a professor of policy or finance because I'm definitely not a professor of finance. But certainly to me, we have many very easy things we could do in front of us, and we haven't done them. And so I just list this slide here to show a bit of a busy picture of some of the partnerships that our laboratory has been able to do. You see the flags of the countries where my team has been able to build some of the models of their power system so we can look at how far they are towards integrating renewable energy or the amount of energy storage or energy access issues. And in the middle, you see some of the companies that we've been able to launch that do everything from clean energy financing to deploying mini grids in remote areas such as Virunga Power to working on micro hydropower, Natel Energy, smart vehicles on the grid, Pear City, and a whole variety of efforts that have at least taught me that we are mainly lacking ambition. We are not lacking technical tools or financial tools to try to work on what I would call broadly the just energy transition. And so, of course, everyone here has probably seen, but maybe not digested, this kind of very simple picture of where we are in terms of the black line showing the almost exponential increase of emissions, despite some nice stories in Denmark and California and Kenya and Nicaragua and Costa Rica of being largely clean energy powered. Globally, we're way behind every assessment of where we need to be in terms of the light blue bar at the top, where current policies would put us if we were really acting on them, to where we need to be, which is the green line at the bottom that essentially goes through a transition by the middle of this century, really only 25 years away, although that's shocking to those of us over 50. But to moving to really a clean energy-based economy, there are a few isolated success stories, but largely my generation is handing your generation a huge problem that we have done very little to do, except for profit off of. And so I say that not to just to depress you, but just to highlight how urgent the problem is. And the targets that have been negotiated by the UN, the 2-degree maximum temperature rise by the Paris climate agreements, and then the 1.5 degrees that was aspirational. Now, almost every expert thinks that we are on a path to warm the planet by 3 degrees or more. Maybe 3 is conservative. I still hold out hope for 2, 2.5, but I recognize the window is shrinking. And if we just look at this picture of New York City in May 2023, and then 2 days later, on May the 7th, looking as dark and as gloomy as some of the science fiction movies for 2049, just highlighting how much we have moved into the world of climate change already. And so, where I highlight the story is that it's not just about climate. However little or much we've done in terms of clean energy, it's really the broader set of these sustainable development indicators, the 17 United Nations agreed to sustainable development goals. Number 7 is the one that I work on most directly, clean energy access for all, meaning that of the 700 million people without electricity today around the planet, the prospect for them reaching electricity access by 2030 is poor. But also many others. I work on the health indicator, on food access, a number of them. And you can see from the red here that we are far off target of meeting many of these goals. And so this is not a surprise to any of you, but it just puts in sort of context for me the degree to which, while we've done some very, very impressive innovations on clean energy, our deployment landscape worldwide is very poor, which is why, for me, a talk about finance and carbon is really about finding ways to unlock things that should be easy. So this analysis is based on the agreement that former US President Biden and current Chinese President Xi signed in 2023, and that was to try to accelerate the world's transition to clean energy, the so-called Sunnylands Agreement that was famously signed in San Francisco. And if we look at the trajectory we're on, that's the data leading up to when this paper was published. You can see we would roughly double the amount of clean energy worldwide by 2030. That's not bad. But this commitment to triple the amount of clean energy used worldwide, that's the green bar at the far right. And if you just add up the size of that green bar and compare it to where the world was just 3 years ago in 2022, they're about the same size. And so what you can see is that we will currently miss our 2030 target by about the amount of clean energy we have installed worldwide just 3 years ago. So that's a fairly glum picture of where we are and what we're passing to your generation. And so I would argue, before any detailed discussions about finances and carbon pricing and social cost of carbon, and I'll drop the social cost of carbon link in the chat because I do think it's one of the most complete ways to think about the environmental and the human rights impacts of our current fossil fuel dominated economies. The real issue is that we have many, many tools available to accelerate our pathway, and we are not on pace for them. And so, one remarkable number to keep in mind is that since about 2021, it has been cheaper in much of the world to build a new clean energy power plant with energy storage than it is to operate an existing fossil plant. That's an absolutely amazing statement. If you go on Bloomberg New Energy News or The Economist, you will find this statement repeated again and again. And it's backed up by the fact that more than 90% of new energy projects worldwide this year, last year, and the year before were all clean energy projects. And despite that, we are still far off pace as I'm describing here. So, what's the problem? If clean energy is cheaper, if we can deploy it, as this graph shows, why have we done so little to get there? And so, if I were to pull one fact out of the world of energy finance, it would be that total global investment in clean energy last year was about $1.2 trillion. That sounds impressive. But if we look at the subsidies for fossil fuels around the planet, those subsidies, depending whose math and accounting you use, total between $5 and $8 trillion a year. So the capital we're investing in clean energy is perhaps 20% of just the subsidies that exist for fossil fuels, which come in many forms. Permitting and permits for oil and gas, or railroads that are built to move these technologies or pipelines. And so it is currently a very, very uneven economic playing field between fossil energy and dirty energy. And if I were to summarize that story, it's largely that the most affluent, call it 10% of the world's population, listed here on this picture on the left, emit more than half of the world's greenhouse gases and are paying themselves handsomely to do so. And yet the poorest half of the planet are less than 7% of the world's emissions. So in some sense, what we really need are strategies, investments by governments, by companies, regulations, whatever mixture you think will work best in your own local context, so that we can give the opportunity for the poorest half of the planet to increase their emissions by perhaps a factor of 3, while the richest 1% of the planet reduce their emissions by a factor of 30. And I think you go a long way before finding anyone who believes that the richest 1 or 10% are likely to voluntarily reduce their emissions by a factor of 30. So we are in a very unequal and unjust planet. And I'm often reminded of this just by driving past a large billboard in my former town of Oakland, California, in the USA. And this billboard shows that there is a 10-year difference in life expectancy between the most affluent postal code in this city of Oakland, a city of about 500,000, 94611 is that postal code, and just one digit away, 94621, quite nearby, the life expectancy is a full 10 years less. Now, that's not all due to climate, but it highlights healthcare and risks of a whole variety of features and how we can live in such a divided world. And anyone who has driven through an urban area worldwide and it goes from a rich suburb or a rich community to a poor favela or slum or whatever you call it, sees over and over again that story. So after using most of my time to depress you, let me kind of highlight why I think the opportunities to invest in clean energy are so dramatic. And so I'll use the case of California. And some of you may say, well, California, that's a rich state and a rich nation. I'm not sure how that applies to me living in Kenya or Bangladesh or South Sudan or East Timor or anywhere. But I want to just highlight how much what you see on the landscape is a function of ambition, not of base resources. And so, in brief, California's first climate law said that the state should meet 20% of its energy needs from clean energy by 2010. And California missed that target. It didn't reach 20% of its energy from clean sources until 2013. And I'll define clean in a second. The next target was to be one-third powered by clean energy in 2020, and California met its 2020 goal in 2016. So from missing its 2010 target and meeting it only in 2013 to achieving its 2020 target only 3 years later shows it wasn't just about having good sun or okay wind and some geothermal. It was about a mixture of policy and marshaling private investment and demonstrating there are ways to do this that value, don't marginalize poor people. And California's target for 2030 was 50%, but when you get to one-third in 2020, you tend to be aggressive. And so California made its 2030 target 60%. But now California is at 78 to 79% clean energy powered. It also has been able to export clean energy to its neighboring states now for the past 113 straight days. Not every minute of every day, but each day it has exported some clean energy. And I think the most interesting aspect of this experiment in California was that while it achieved this through a mixture of public financing and pushing the utilities to meet various green energy targets, enabling individual homeowners and apartment buildings and even renters to install solar. What's most interesting to me, and I think it's the thing that I hope California will be remembered for long in the future, is that California set up a market, a cap and trade system for carbon. So there is a price of carbon emissions. It's about 30 US dollars per ton. But interestingly, California said 35% or more, so this is a floor and not a ceiling, of those funds must be spent on marginalized communities, those at the fence line of dirty facilities, those that have been underinvested in or are overpolluted due to being downwind of power plants or industrial facilities. And to my mind, it's really this story that is the most interesting. And so, again, I know some of you may think California is a rich place. It's a remarkable story. But I want to point out that Costa Rica, with very good hydro resources, has been running almost entirely on clean energy now for well over a decade. Kenya, 40 million person population, about the size of California, is 94% powered by clean energy today. There are interesting cases in both industrialized and industrializing nations that have managed to achieve this through a mixture of, again, takes policy, but it also takes leaders in industry, in civil society, environmental groups, and others were really highlighting the story. And what I won't get into, just because we're running close to time, is the fact that one of the features that we find again and again, and I'll just use some US data to highlight the story, is that if you don't find ways to reform not just your energy markets, but also your institutions, you may run into some real disparities. And so this paper that in the US and in Europe received quite a bit of notoriety was one where we used satellite and remote sensing data, lots of machine learning and AI to go look at who had solar across the United States and who didn't. And what we found probably won't surprise you. What we saw by looking at not only rooftops, but also looking at income in neighborhoods was that communities that were majority Caucasian, white, were more likely to have solar. African American communities and so-called Latinx or Hispanic communities were less likely to have solar. That probably doesn't surprise you. But what I hope does surprise you is that we were able to do this analysis, not just broadly, we used all these kind of nice machine learning and data science tools I won't get into. But what we found is that this was true from people who were living below the poverty line, below $25,000 a year, US dollars a year of income, to 250,000. So an order of magnitude of income range. We found that this held very constant. And so what it says to me is something very fundamental, but also very, very simple. And that is, if you don't find a way to make your energy transition inclusive, what you do is something very regressive, as economists call it. You provide money in terms of subsidies for electric vehicles or subsidies for installing solar at a home or business, but you largely give it to the groups you're used to giving money to. And so finding mechanisms to empower low-income communities, indigenous communities, communities of color, as they're called in the United States, what you do is you replicate the old model, not do something new. And you see this paper got quite a bit of attention. It was part of an effort under the former US administration, when I would say we had a functioning government under President Biden, to invest in clean energy for all, not what we seem to be doing today. So I highlight that really just to wrap up and to get to one last point, and that is these transitions are really quite possible. So I show you this picture here for, again, for California. And this shows the amount of clean energy used over the course of one day, from midnight to midnight. And you can see we were importing energy, we were using fossil gas, wind, hydro, but really this big block during the day of solar. And what was needed to enable this transition was to not only generate lots of solar power, that's not so difficult because of how low cost solar is, but because we have this thing called nighttime, we need to find a way to use and to store that solar for off-peak hours, for when the sun is not up. And so what happened was a series of mandates requiring that if you install solar, you must also install storage. And so subsidies for solar went away in California several years ago, but subsidies for installing batteries, storage continued. And so what you can see here is over 3 years, California added a great deal of storage so that in the early morning and the late evening, those batteries could be providing power into the grid. And these are at scales from the battery in an electric vehicle selling power back to the grid, to large storage facilities in the desert near cities. And I highlight this again just to conclude with an example of a bit of integration of taking advantage of the technology and economics of clean energy, but also a very direct and very intentional spending on clean energy for low-income communities. And I could have told this same story in terms of the energy transition going on in Kenya. Again, they have a very strong resource of wind, a very strong resource of geothermal and solar. They have not installed anywhere near this much storage, but it's an example of what you can do in a largely affluent and a largely not affluent economy to try to build the transition. So I know we're right at time. Let me stop there, and hopefully there's time for one or two questions or comments. And so I'll stop sharing to go back to the overall picture, but thanks for the chance just to highlight a couple examples of how on the energy side this transition could take place.
Thank you, Professor Kaiman. I think our participants enjoyed your speech. I think I will ask them to give you a big round of applause. I think they are giving you virtual applause, but maybe even with sound. I also am inviting our participants to ask the questions to Professor. You can put the questions in chat or raise your hand virtually, so however you want. I think we already have one question from Leon. This is for us, sorry. So let's start.
I'm not sure I see it in the chat, so if you could just
Please.
Hi, Professor. Thank you so much for your interesting presentation. My question is about, the implementation of some of the things that you mentioned, especially when it comes to, justice and equity and access to energy. So, what are some of the challenges or hurdles that you have encountered or noticed in trying to make, clean energy accessible and affordable to everyone? And what are some of the strategies or approaches that you use to overcome it?
So that's a great question. So I fear that the answer, and I don't mean to make this sound glib or snappy, but I fear that the biggest hurdle that I see is unfortunately my generation. And that is for everything I showed in the slides in terms of the low cost of clean energy, the fact that clean energy projects tend to be quicker and under budget as opposed to over budget. My generation, sort of those in power today in the world, have done a great deal to block this transition, not to enable it. And so the examples or the opportunities that I see are often where people find clever routes around the system. So very, very quick, one example is there's a quite successful startup company in Dhaka in Bangladesh. It's called SolShare, S-O-L, Share. And what they build is a peer-to-peer network where homes and businesses in low-income parts of Dhaka are able to sell power or barter power to each other by building the connections and using existing internet to track power that is sold neighbor to neighbor. They started by building mini grids and they found that connecting them together didn't quite work with the national utility, but by working in poor areas, they were able to build what has now become an award-winning network of clean energy sales neighbor to neighbor. And I'll highlight that because while any given example doesn't prove how one can do it, what it does highlight is that until we can find or work in states that are like California, really looking for transitions. And again, I would put Kenya in this category. I would put Costa Rica. I would put Nicaragua for all of its political problems in a place that has tried to leverage clean energy. Elsewhere, it really takes an effort to demonstrate to the powers that be that clean energy solutions in many cases are easier, faster, quicker to do than what they're used to. The problem is that all of the biases and kickbacks and payments that we routinely make to the world's rich keep them tied to the old energy economy. So that's not a full answer, but I do hope that it kind of illustrates that this creativity at the margins still gives me a lot of hope that we can do this. We just need to do it more quickly.
Thank you for your answer. We have also one question. Low-income countries need to build systems to support the clean energy transition, but how can flexible financing be accessible to support these goals?
So another great question. I guess there's no single answer because where you are matters greatly. But one of the tools that has been incredibly helpful has been the rise of mobile frictionless money. So in East Africa, M-Pesa is online money on your phone There's multiple applications in China and Southeast Asia. And one of the most interesting features is that while these clean energy systems are cheaper than fossil energy, unless there is a way that communities, poor people, single mothers, many disenfranchised groups can access even the little bits of financing that they need, it's very difficult. Credit is not available, interest rates are very high. And so, again, places that have pushed for mobile money or peer-to-peer financing, such as the Grameen banks in parts of Southeast Asia and South Asia. Grameen Shakti is the energy version of that in India and Bangladesh. These are examples of making credit available without the exorbitant rates that many low-income people have to pay. And so I would say the dance or the partnership that's possible between clean energy and accessible financing without traditional interest rates is one of the strongest predictors that your economy can innovate. And sometimes that's at a state or a large corporate level, but in many cases, it's self-help groups in East Africa. We call this Harambe, so that communities finance for education or business opportunities. But it's this dance that I think is so critical to getting clean energy and clean financing available together.
Okay, thank you for your answer. We also have two questions. The one is from Ricardo. Then, do you consider the tendency of investments got a turn to focus at centralized projects instead of land-intensive big investments? And what would be the recommended share towards the future?
Complicated. I think it's really a question about how do you get the financing in the hands of these kind of lower income local community projects. I would say one of the big innovations. It's still early on. It needs a great deal of effort by people looking to push it. And that would be the rise of what are called mini grids or microgrids or town grids or metro grids, meaning local mixtures of renewable energy, solar, microhydro, possibly wind, with storage, not to power the whole grid, but to meet the needs of a community. And those projects have received bits of funding, but not a very large scale effort. But I do think that working with offices in some ministries of energy or banks and other places that are able to push this ahead are one of the opportunities. And if I just look at the second part of Ricardo's question about Nicaragua, it is a place with very good wind. It has geothermal power, although when Nicaragua first tried geothermal energy in the 1970s and 80s, they unfortunately it was at a time when they also polluted Lake Nicaragua quite significantly, not with geothermal, but with poor management. And so hopefully doing that better in future would take advantage of their resources. And I do apologize. I am going to have to run after one last question because I've got to get to class. So maybe, Sophia, if I could ask you just to pick the last one and then we'll wrap up after that.
Okay, well, I see that Peter is waiting for a question, but also some of them are too shy to raise the hand and they are just messaging us. But I would ask then Peter to ask before we finish the session. Thank you.
So I'll just maybe conclude with saying if this kind of dialogue is of interest, we do have a podcast called energymatters.world where we look at global issues. That podcast, not only we have an episode a week, but we also have a fairly active feedback. There's places to leave questions, comments, suggestions for next episodes. And it's run by a clean energy financier. Her name is Claire Broido and myself. And so maybe this podcast, energymatters.world, might be a place to kind of continue the dialogue because I will have to run to teach my class on environmental justice that starts in 18 minutes.
Thank you so much Professor, for your time and your presentation. I think our participants are really satisfied, and I would ask them to again give you one virtual applause.
Thank you all so much. And I'll just put my Twitter and Blue Sky if people are interested there as well.
Okay, thank you. Tiara, do you want to finish the session, maybe with some information?
Yes, perfect. Thank you so much, Sofia. And thank you so much to our speakers, Mr. Rosenau, Mr. Jordan, and Mr. Kamen for their insights. It was incredibly interesting to see three different sides of access and equity in climate finance. I sure did enjoy it, and I can see from the chat and all the questions that all the participants really loved it as well. Before we conclude our session, I want to highlight a couple of points. The first is that, as you have seen in the chat, we have the attendance form running about there. So it's going to be open for the next hour. So if you could please fill in the attendance form within the next hour, that would be great. It really does help us track participation. Also, our next session will be held on the 21st of October at 1 p.m. UTC. So please double check that with your local time zone and, of course, add the Academy calendar to your Google Calendar or Gmail so that you don't miss it. It also contains the Zoom links that you need. The recording of today's session will be shared with you via email later this week. So yes, thank you so much to everyone. Thank you to our speakers. Now, Ahmed and I will stay in the meeting for a little bit longer, just in case any of you have any questions on the final research projects or your groups. Thank you.
Bye.